The history of Western philosophy. Western philosophy has been central to the development of thought in the world. Breaking down its progress into a linear progression is nearly impossible, and understanding the interplay of various ideas over time is difficult. It arguably began in Greece with the pre-Socratic philosophers, since they were centrally concerned with the construction of the world, and their arguments were primarily metaphysical. Their ideas focused largely on what is real and what is outside the physical world. Socrates and Plato would tackle similar questions, but were also concerned with issues of epistemology and ethics. Aristotle would attempt to answer similar questions in the same fields and expound upon them. Thus, the Greeks can be attributed with setting the stage for Western philosophy. Metaphysics focused on the makeup of the world. Ethics were centrally concerned with how people should act and what right and wrong really mean. Epistemological issues proved the most troublesome for philosophers and set the stage for most issues in contemporary philosophy. Following the fall of the Roman Empire and the onset of the Dark Ages, the Catholic Church became the central figure of the time, and most issues in philosophy were framed within a Christian perspective. Thinkers of this time were mostly members of the clergy and concerned themselves with reconciling Christian theology with classical philosophy. St. Thomas Aquinas is the most influential theologian. He focused on forming Christian-based metaphysics and ethics. As the Enlightenment began, the questions of classical philosophy were addressed again. Furthermore, since the Enlightenment was concerned mostly with rationality, the obvious question of the era's philosophy centered on what we could know. From this debate, two schools of thought developed. Empiricists argue that our knowledge originates only from experience. Without our ability to perceive the world, we cannot acquire knowledge. The implication of this basic premise is that things only exist insofar as we can perceive them. If something cannot be seen, heard, tasted, smelled, or felt, then its existence is not certain. This idea was controversial as it cast into doubt the existence of a soul or God. Idealists, on the other hand, argue that everything we experience is of a mental nature. When carried to its obvious conclusion, this idea cast doubt on any sort of certainty in the physical world. Idealists argue that the physical world cannot be known. People can only understand their own perception of it. This led some to argue that the physical world might not exist. Instead, the world might be composed of packets of perception. The appeal of idealism was manifold. After all, it did not reduce the world into the merely observable and allowed for the existence of intangible things. However, the philosopher Immanuel Kant attempted to reconcile idealism and empiricism. He agreed that there were a few components of knowledge that we could comprehend without experience or perception, which included basic ideas of physical spaces and temporality. Kant's approach was influential since it did not assert metaphysical truths. Basically, no individual can assert that there is an actual physical plane where things exist. Also, it cannot be argued with any sort of certainty that a physical world does not exist. Kant did not encourage any sort of metaphysical argument, but instead shifted the debate away from metaphysics entirely, opting instead to focus attention on the limits of what could be known. With this move, Kant centered epistemology, not metaphysics, as the core concern of Western philosophy. This shift toward epistemological questions continues to set the stage for most contemporary philosophical issues. Friedrich Nietzsche introduced an approach similar to Kant's to cast doubt on language and the ability to express an idea effectively with words. This initiated the trend of postmodernism, which is a philosophical inquiry into our most basic presuppositions, including our fundamental ability to communicate effectively with language. In many ways, Western philosophy can be seen as a progression of thought that has reduced the number of questions relevant to the field while simultaneously making them infinitely more complicated and difficult to approach. It has now become an inquiry into our most fundamental human characteristics and abilities. The answers to these questions are fundamental to understanding self and how people function. Their answers may have a profoundly important effect upon mankind.